The moment Henrietta Sullivan stepped off the eastbound platform and onto the westbound one at the Kansas City depot, ticket clutched in her white-knuckled hand, she understood with absolute clarity that her brothers had not sent her west to begin a new life. They had sent her west to vanish from the old one. It was the spring of 1882, and the air smelled of coal smoke and horse manure, and something else beneath it all, something sharp and uncertain, like the edge of a world she had never been invited to choose for herself. The depot was loud and crowded, full of men in dusty coats and women clutching carpet bags, porters calling out destinations and conductors punching tickets with mechanical indifference. Henrietta stood among all of it and felt as though she were made of glass, present, visible, and terribly easy to shatter. She was 23 years old, with dark brown hair pinned severely at the back of her neck, gray eyes that had learned early in life to reveal as little as possible, and a quality about her that people sometimes mistook for coldness, but was, in fact, the particular stillness of a woman who had spent years learning to take up as little space as possible. She wore a blue traveling dress that had been her mother's, let out at the seams and taken in at the waist, and she carried one carpet bag and one small trunk that the porter had already loaded onto the westbound train without her asking. Her brothers had arranged everything. That was the way of it with Franklin and George Sullivan. They arranged things, and the things they arranged were never really about the person at the center of the arrangement. The trouble had started, or rather, the visible trouble had started 3 weeks ago, when Henrietta had refused to sign the papers that Franklin placed before her at the dinner table in their family home in St. Louis. The papers would have transferred her share of their late father's property to her brothers jointly. Their father, William Sullivan, had died the previous autumn, and in his will he had left his 3 children equal portions of his estate, which included the house in St. Louis and a considerable parcel of farmland east of Springfield. Henrietta's third was hers by law, by her father's clear intention, and by every moral right she could claim. Franklin had not cared about any of those things. He was 31, with their father's heavy jaw and none of their father's decency, and he had explained to Henrietta, very patiently, as though she were a child or a simpleton, that the property would be best managed as a single holding, that she would be taken care of, that she really had no need of her own funds since she was unmarried and living in their household anyway. George, 4 years younger than Franklin and 6 years older than Henrietta, had said nothing at all during this speech, which was his way of agreeing with everything Franklin said without having to be accountable for any of it. Henrietta had refused. She had looked Franklin in the eye across the dinner table and said, quietly and without any drama, that she would not be signing the papers, that the property was hers by right, and that she expected it to be managed accordingly. The weeks that followed had been unpleasant in the way that only a house can be unpleasant when the people inside it are conducting a war through silences and small cruelties. Her meals grew cold. Her room grew drafty. The household staff, who answered to Franklin, were suddenly always occupied when she needed something. And then, 12 days after her refusal, Franklin had come to her room in the evening with a train ticket and a composed expression, and told her that he had arranged a position for her in a town called Millhaven in the Colorado Territory as a housekeeper for a family named Archer, and that she would be leaving in 1 week. She had stared at him. "You cannot compel me to go anywhere, Franklin." "No," he had agreed pleasantly. "I cannot. But I can make your situation here quite difficult, Henrietta, and I think you know that. The Archers are a respectable family. You'll have your room and your board. It's a fresh start. A fresh start." She had turned the phrase over in her mind for 7 days while she packed her belongings and wrote 2 letters. One to her father's attorney, a Mr. Beaumont in St. Louis, detailing her circumstances and instructing him to hold her portion of the estate in trust pending her explicit authorization, and one to a schoolmate named Clara Briggs who lived in Denver, telling Clara only that she was coming west and that she would write again when she was settled. She had not told Franklin about the letter to the attorney. That small, quiet act of defiance was the only real power she had managed to hold on to, and she held it now inside her chest like a coal pressed against her ribs, warming her from the inside even as everything else around her felt desperately cold. Now she was standing on a westbound platform in Kansas City with her trunk already loaded and her ticket reading Millhaven, Colorado, and she was trying to decide whether she was going to do exactly what her brothers expected of her or something else entirely. She was so deep in this deliberation that she nearly walked straight into the man. He was coming from the direction of the ticket window, moving with the particular economy of motion that belongs to people who have spent a great deal of time in open spaces. No wasted steps, no unnecessary gestures, just a body that knew where it was going and moved there directly. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, wearing a brown canvas coat and a hat that had been through more weather than most men see in a lifetime. He stopped when he saw her, or rather, he stopped when he saw what she was holding. It was the ticket. She had been staring at it with an expression that she was not aware of, but which he apparently read without difficulty. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Excuse me," she said, stepping aside. He didn't move on immediately. He stood for a moment, the way a man stands when something has caught his attention and he hasn't yet decided what to do about it. "That the westbound to Millhaven you're holding?" he asked. She blinked. "It is." "You heading there or thinking about not heading there?" The question was direct enough to surprise her. She was accustomed to men who circled around their meaning, who used politeness as a form of concealment. This man was doing neither. His eyes were a steady brown, the color of creek water in summer, and they were looking at her with an attention that was not rude and not intrusive but was simply honest, present. "I'm not sure," she said, which was the truest thing she had said to another person in several weeks. He nodded slowly as though that were a reasonable answer. "You know anybody in Millhaven?" "No." "You got family there?" "No, I am to work for a family named Archer." Something moved across his face at that, not quite recognition, not quite concern, something in between. "The Archers on Creek Road." She felt a small tightening in her chest. "You know them?" "I know the area," he said carefully. "Millhaven's small. Most folks know of each other." The care in his voice told her something, though she couldn't have said exactly what. She looked at him more directly then, studying him the way she'd learned to study people, looking not for what they showed, but for what they kept behind what they showed. He was perhaps 28 or 29, whether the way Western men often were, with the kind of face that would look roughly the same at 40 as it did now. There was a quality of steadiness to him that she found herself wanting to lean toward and distrusting herself for wanting. "You work in Millhaven?" she asked. "I've got a place outside of town," he said. "Small spread cattle mostly. I come east to Kansas City a few times a year for supplies and business." He paused. "Owen Walden." He offered his name the way he offered everything else, plainly, without ceremony. "Henrietta Sullivan," she said. "Miss Sullivan." He looked at the ticket again, then at her. "That train leaves in 40 minutes. If you're not sure you want to be on it, now is the time to be sure." "I don't have much choice about being on it," she said. "Most people have more choices than they think," he said. He wasn't being glib. He seemed to genuinely believe it. She felt something twist in her, some mixture of irritation and something that was harder to name. "The situation is not as simple as that." "No situation is," he agreed. "But simple and possible aren't the same thing." He seemed to consider something, then said, "If you're going to Millhaven and you're uncertain about where you're landing, the town has a decent boarding house run by a woman named Ruth Calloway. She's honest and she's fair, and she doesn't ask more questions than are necessary." It was an oddly specific offer of information for a stranger to provide. She looked at him carefully. "Why are you telling me that?" "'Cause," he said, and for just a moment the steadiness in his face gave way to something quieter and more personal. "You look like somebody who needed to know that there's more than one door, even if they can only see one right now." The locomotive at the far end of the platform exhaled a long, shuddering breath of steam, and the conductor called out the first boarding announcement. Around them, people began to move. Henrietta looked at the ticket in her hand. She looked at the train. She looked at Owen Walden. "The boarding house," she said. "Ruth Calloway." "Yes, ma'am, and it's in town, not out on Creek Road, right on the main street." She folded the ticket carefully, put it in her bag, and picked up her carpet bag from where she'd set it at her feet. "Thank you, Mr. Walden," she said. "You're welcome, Miss Sullivan." He hesitated, then added, "The train makes one stop between here and Millhaven at a place called Dorado Station. Takes about 9 hours total. If you need anything on the journey, I'll be in the third car." She almost asked why he had told her that, whether it was simple information or something more, but the conductor called again, and she turned toward the boarding line, and the question dissolved into the noise and motion of the platform. She did not look back. But she was aware, with the heightened attention of a woman who has had to be very careful for a very long time, that he remained standing on the platform until she had stepped up into the car. The journey across the Kansas plain was the longest 9 hours Henrietta had ever experienced, and paradoxically, the most peaceful. There was something clarifying about the open land. Missouri had forests and rivers and the layered intimacy of settled country. Kansas opened out like an exhaled breath, vast and uncomplicated, the sky enormous above the yellowed spring grass. She sat at the window and watched it pass and let herself think in the way she hadn't been able to think in weeks, with something approaching honesty. She thought about the letter to Mr. Beaumont and hoped it had arrived safely. She thought about Clara in Denver and wondered if she would ever actually get there. She thought about her father, who had been a quiet man with strong opinions that he kept largely to himself, and who had treated her with the particular combination of love and inadvertent limitation that characterized even the most well-meaning fathers of the era, loving her truly, while simultaneously assuming that her life would be shaped primarily by the men around her. She had loved him deeply and grieved him genuinely, and she thought now that part of her grief was for the fact that he had not seen, quite fully, what leaving her in the care of Franklin and George would mean. At Dorado Station, the train stopped for water and a brief change of the locomotive crew. Passengers stepped out onto the platform to stretch, and Henrietta stepped out among them, grateful for the cool afternoon air. She did not expect to see Owen Walden standing at the platform railing, looking out at the flat horizon, but there he was. He glanced over when she stepped down from the car, and something in his face, not quite a smile, but the predecessor of one, acknowledged her. "How are you finding the journey?" he asked when she had drifted in his direction without quite intending to. "The landscape is remarkable," she said. "I've never been this far west." "Where are you from, Miss Sullivan?" "St. Louis originally, though I've lived in several places." She paused. "My father traveled for business when I was young, and we traveled with him. I spent time in Philadelphia, in Cincinnati, in New Orleans for a winter." She heard herself talking and was faintly surprised. She was not typically a person who offered personal information readily. There was something about this man's quality of attention that made her feel cautiously that she would not be made to regret it. "New Orleans," he said. "What's it like? I've never been east of Kansas City myself." "Extraordinary," she said, "and very strange. The city has its own rules about everything, the food, the music, the way people speak to each other. It doesn't feel like anywhere else in the country." She looked at him. "Have you always been in Colorado?" "Came out from Tennessee when I was 17, he said. "With my uncle, who had the idea of ranching. He died 3 years after we arrived, and I kept the place going." He said it without self-pity, simply as fact. "It's been 8 years now. I suppose I'm Colorado through and through at this point." 17 and alone in the West, taking on a ranch after his uncle died. She considered what kind of person that made a man, what kind of discipline and loneliness and self-reliance it built into a person over 8 years of hard country. "You said you knew the area around Creek Road," she said. It was not a subtle redirection, but subtlety felt, At Dorado Station, with the wind coming across the plain and the locomotive hissing quietly behind them, like an unnecessary formality. Owen turned slightly toward her, and the predecessor of a smile resolved itself. "The Archers are hard people," he said carefully. "The husband he has a temper, and he runs his household the way some men run their cattle, tight. I'm not saying this to alarm you, only so you know what I know." Henrietta absorbed this without any visible reaction, though inside her something hardened with quiet determination. "I see," she said. "Mrs. Archer is a decent woman," he added. "She does the best she can. It's a difficult situation." He looked at her steadily. "You don't have to go there if it's not what you want. The boarding house," she said, "is a genuine option. And what would I do for income at a boarding house? Mrs. Calloway might have need of a helper. The town has a school. The teacher this past year was not much of a teacher, and the board has been looking for a replacement since January." He paused. "Can you teach?" She almost laughed. "I have a considerable education. My father believed in it for daughters as well as sons." She felt the small, familiar ache of that, how extraordinary it was that her father's belief in her education had still led to a world where her brothers could try to strip her of her inheritance and ship her west to disappear. "Yes, I can teach." "Then there's your income," he said. The conductor called out the boarding warning. They turned back toward the train together, not touching, not hurrying, and Henrietta felt something she had not felt in a very long time, the particular sensation of being accompanied. Not managed, not directed, not arranged. Accompanied. "Mr. Walden," she said when they reached the steps of her car. "Miss Sullivan, why are you doing this? You don't know me at all." He looked at her with those steady, creek-water eyes, and there was a long enough pause that she thought he was choosing his words with real care. "I saw your face on the platform in Kansas City," he said at last, "and I recognized something in it. That look a person gets when they've been told their only road leads one direction, and they're not sure they believe it, but they're not sure what else to do." He paused. "My uncle had that look the last 2 years of his life. I couldn't do much for him. I thought maybe I could do something for you." He touched the brim of his hat. "And I reckon I'd like to know how it turns out." She held his gaze for a moment, and then she nodded once and stepped up into the car. Millhaven announced itself first as a water tower, and then as a collection of wooden buildings, and then, as the train slowed and the platform came into view, as a small but real town in the foothills east of the Rockies, with a main street visible from the depot and mountains just close enough on the horizon to make the sky feel like a gift. It was early evening, and the light was the particular golden orange of western spring dusk, and Henrietta stepped down from the train with her carpet bag and turned to watch the porter unload her trunk. And for one ringing moment, she felt the full weight of where she was 2 days from St. Louis, 9 hours from Kansas City, in a town where she knew no one and was committed to nothing except the decision she had made on a platform in the middle of the country, because a stranger had told her there was more than one door. Owen Walden appeared at her elbow as the trunk came down. "I can have your trunk taken to Mrs. Calloway's if you've decided." "I've decided," she said. He arranged it with the porter with a few words and the exchange of coin, and then he picked up her carpet bag without asking permission, which she would ordinarily have found presumptuous, and said, "It's 3 blocks up the main street. I'll walk you." Millhaven in the evening was alive with the modest industry of a working western town. The sounds of horses and wheels, the light from saloon windows, men coming out of the feed store, a woman sweeping her porch, 2 boys chasing a dog down the alley between the hardware store and the telegraph office. It smelled of horses and wood smoke and the particular mineral sweetness of mountain air meeting prairie. Ruth Calloway's boarding house was a 2-story white structure on the north end of Main Street, with a porch that ran the full width of the front and a lamp burning in the window. Ruth herself opened the door before they knocked. She was a woman in her late 50s with iron-gray hair and sharp blue eyes, and a face that had been pretty once and was now something better than pretty, which was interesting. "Owen Walden," she said, in a tone that suggested she was simultaneously pleased to see him and not particularly surprised. "And who's this?" "Miss Henrietta Sullivan," Owen said. "She's come west from St. Louis and she needs a room. She's a school teacher." "I haven't yet been engaged as a school teacher," Henrietta clarified, "but I am qualified." Ruth Calloway looked at her for a moment with those sharp eyes, not unkindly, but thoroughly. "Room and board is $2 a week, payable in advance. Meals at 7, noon, and 6. I don't keep the kitchen open after hours. No male visitors above the porch, not that I expect you'd be the type." She stepped aside. "Come in, then. Owen, set that bag in the hall." He did, and then he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, and Ruth Calloway looked between the two of them with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and not quite succeeding. "Thank you, Mr. Walden," Henrietta said, "for everything today." "My pleasure, Miss Sullivan." He turned his hat in his hands once, a small, uncharacteristic gesture of uncertainty. "The school board meets at the courthouse on Thursday evenings. Judge Parsons is the chairman. He's a reasonable man." "I'll remember that." There was a pause, the kind that contains more information than the words on either side of it. "I ride into town most Saturdays," Owen said, "for supplies or the post. If you need anything, if there's anything that needs looking into, you can leave a message with Calloway here." "I will," Henrietta said. He put his hat back on, nodded to Ruth, nodded to Henrietta, and walked back out into the golden Colorado evening. Ruth Calloway shut the door and turned around with an expression that had entirely given up on being neutral. "Well," she said, "in 20 years of running this house, I've never seen Owen Walden walk a woman to my front door. Come and have some supper, Miss Sullivan. You look like you haven't eaten properly in days." She hadn't, but she found that she was not thinking about that. She was thinking about the particular quality of the silence after a door closes on a person you have only just met and already, without any reasonable explanation, do not want to stop talking to. The days that followed were the most industrious of Henrietta's life, and she was grateful for it. She met with Judge Parsons on the Thursday evening, just as Owen had suggested, and she presented her educational credentials. She had, with foresight she now appreciated, packed her certificates from the Philadelphia Academy, where she had studied for 3 years, and she answered his questions with the combination of intelligence and directness that had served her poorly with her brothers, and served her very well in the room full of school board members who had been dealing with inadequate instruction for their children since January. She was offered the position with a handshake and a start date of the following Monday. The pay was $22 a month, which was enough to cover her board at Ruth Calloway's, with a modest amount remaining for necessities. It was less than she deserved and more than she had expected, and she accepted it with genuine gratitude and then went back to the boarding house and wrote 3 letters. One to Mr. Beaumont in St. Louis confirming her new address, one to Clara in Denver to tell her where she had landed, and one to Franklin that she was not going to the Archers, that she had obtained employment, and that she did not require anything from him. She did not mail that 3rd letter immediately. She put it on her writing table and looked at it for a while and felt the particular satisfaction of words that exist because they need to exist, regardless of whether they do any practical good. She mailed it in the morning. Teaching in Millhaven turned out to be entirely different from what she had imagined, and in most ways, more interesting. The schoolhouse had 31 students ranging in age from 6 to 16, of varying backgrounds and levels of preparation, children of ranchers and miners and the town's tradespeople, 2 children whose father was a Ute man and whose mother was a white woman from Nebraska, and 1 girl who was the daughter of the town's Chinese laundryman and who was quietly brilliant at mathematics and quietly starved for someone to notice it. Henrietta noticed it on the first day and began assigning this girl, whose name was May Lynn, extra problems immediately. May Lynn looked up at her with dark, careful eyes and said nothing, but the next morning she arrived at school 20 minutes early with the problems completed and 2 additional ones she had invented for herself. This was the kind of moment that made Henrietta certain she was doing the right work. She was walking home from school on the second Saturday. It was the 1st of May now, and the mountains to the west were still snow-capped and extravagant against a blue sky that she had not yet stopped being astonished by, when she saw the familiar brown canvas coat at the hitching post outside Hatch's general store. She had been thinking about him more than she wanted to admit. Not with any particular narrative attached, not with expectations. She was too practical for that and too aware of her own circumstances to indulge in the kind of fantasies that felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. But he appeared in her thoughts with a regularity that she had stopped fighting, the way you stop fighting a river current that is simply stronger than your arm. He came out of the store carrying a paper parcel and a coil of rope and stopped when he saw her, and that predecessor of a smile appeared. "Miss Sullivan," he said. "Mr. Walden." She smiled back and noticed that smiling at him felt natural in a way that smiling at people in general had not felt for a long time. "How is the ranch?" "Calving season," he said, with an expression that communicated the particular exhausted satisfaction of a man in the middle of exactly the kind of work he was meant to do. 3 weeks of it left, probably. You look like Millhaven is treating you well." "I have the teaching position," she said. "Started Monday." Something shifted in his face, a real pleasure not performed. "That's good news. Is it going well?" "Better than I expected." She told him about Mei Lin and the self-invented problems, and he listened with the quality of attention she was coming to recognize as characteristic of him, fully engaged, not half-present the way many people were, not waiting for his turn to speak but actually listening. "Sounds like you found somebody who needed what you've got to give," he said. "I think so." She paused. "It's strange. I was very angry when I came here. I am still angry if I'm being honest. But I find that the teaching gives me somewhere to put myself that isn't anger, and that feels, I think that's valuable." He was quiet for a moment. The street moved around them, a buckboard rattling past, 2 cowboys from a nearby outfit riding toward the saloon, the blacksmith's hammer ringing in the middle distance. "Can I ask what made you angry?" he said. "Only if you want to say." She looked at him, making the assessment she always made, and found, as she kept finding with him, that the scales tipped toward trust in a way she couldn't entirely account for, and had decided to accept rather than keep questioning. She told him about Franklin and George, about the will, about the papers she had refused to sign, about the train ticket, and the position with the Archers that had been designed to take her far enough away that she couldn't object inconveniently to their plans. She told him about the letter to the attorney. She told him about the 3 weeks of cold meals and drafty rooms. She told him all of it in a measured, factual way that she noticed was still shaking, very slightly, in her voice. He listened to all of it without interrupting her once. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Not an uncomfortable silence, but a thinking one, the silence of a person who is taking what they've been told seriously enough to actually think about it. "Your attorney in St. Louis," he said finally. "You trust him." "My father did. He drew up the will himself, which means he knows exactly what it says." "Then your position legally is probably better than your brothers think it is." He paused. "Are they likely to come after you here, try to compel the situation further?" She hadn't let herself think about that fully, but she thought about it now. "Franklin is, he likes winning. He may think that my having left is sufficient victory. He has what he wanted, practically speaking, because I'm not there to contest things locally. But if the attorney," she stopped. "If Mr. Beaumont moves to protect the estate as I instructed, Franklin will know I'm still fighting, and he may not like that." "If that happens," Owen said, and his voice was very steady, "and if there's anything I can do, you tell me." He held her gaze. "I mean that." She believed him. That was the strange and slightly undoing thing. She believed him without any of the usual internal negotiation. "Why?" she said, and the question was genuine, not a challenge. "You still don't know me very well." "I know you well enough," he said. And then, with the careful precision of a man measuring words, "I'd like to know you better if you're willing." She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. The blacksmith's hammer rang out again, and a child ran past with a hoop, and the mountain light lay across the street in long gold bars. "I am willing," she said. He rode into town more than once a week after that. Sometimes he had an obvious reason: supplies, the post office, a meeting with the veterinarian about a sick calf. And sometimes the reason was transparently Henrietta, and they both understood this without either of them saying so. He would find her walking home from school or sitting on Ruth Calloway's porch with papers to mark, and they would talk about everything and nothing: the state of the calving, the progress of her students, the water rights dispute that was developing between two ranches north of town, the book she was reading, the family from Kentucky that had just arrived in Millhaven and set up a bakery in the building next to the telegraph office. She went to the ranch for the first time in mid-May, which was notable because the generally understood protocol of the era meant that a woman did not go to a man's ranch unless the intention of that visit was clear enough to make the trip appropriate. Ruth Calloway, to her credit, said nothing about it directly, but she did look at Henrietta with those sharp blue eyes over the breakfast table and ask how Owen Walden's calving season was coming along, which was her way of asking whether Henrietta knew what she was doing. "Very well, I believe," Henrietta said. "He mentioned the loss rate has been lower than last year." Ruth poured more coffee and was quiet for a moment. "Owen Walden is a good man," she said. "I've known him since he came here at 17. He's had a difficult time of it in some ways: the loneliness of that place out there, the work, the years since his uncle died. He doesn't complain. But I think he would be considerably happier with somebody worth talking to." Henrietta looked at her coffee cup. "He seems able to talk to most people." "He can talk to most people," Ruth agreed. "He talks to very few of them." She stood up with her coffee cup and then paused at the kitchen door. "It's a handsome spread," she added, with the complete neutrality of a woman who has said exactly what she intended to say and knows it. The ranch was 8 miles from town, northwest along a creek that ran clear and fast with snowmelt, and was lined with cottonwoods in the first bright green of their spring leaves. The land rolled into the foothills in a way that suggested the mountains beyond without quite showing them, a slow, deliberate reveal that felt almost theatrical, as though the landscape was presenting itself with intention. Owen met her at the gate on horseback, having ridden out when he heard the buckboard she'd hired from the livery, and he looked different out here than he did in town. More himself, she thought, more fully occupying whatever space he was in. He had left the canvas coat behind and was wearing a plain work shirt and a pair of worn leather chaps over his trousers, and his hat was pushed back on his head, and he looked. She noticed this with a physiological directness that she chose to simply observe rather than react to extraordinarily attractive. The ranch was modest and well kept. A main house of good lumber, a barn, a bunkhouse where 2 hands lived, corrals, a kitchen garden that he tended himself. He showed her around with the particular pride of a person showing something they have built with their own hands from nearly nothing. The pride that is not boasting, but is simply the quiet pleasure of loving a thing you made. "The hands are out on the south pasture," he said. "Pete Dolan and Caleb Rays, they've been with me 3 years each. Good men." She walked with him through the barn where 2 horses looked at her with calm, dark eyes and past the corrals where the new calves were visible, small, wobbling, impossibly young. She stopped at the fence. "They're extraordinary," she said. He came to stand beside her at the fence, his arms folded on the top rail, and they watched the calves move in the afternoon light. They were close enough that she could have reached out and taken his arm, and she was aware of the distance between them in the very specific way you are aware of a thing you are choosing not to do. "I've been thinking about you," he said, not looking away from the calves. "More than is probably wise." Her heart performed a maneuver she hadn't expected from it. "Have you?" she said. "Yes." Now he looked at her. "I thought I should say so plainly, because I don't like the alternative, which is not saying so and having you not know." She turned to face him. He was very close, not improperly close, but close enough that she could see the line of his jaw and the specific quality of the way he was looking at her, which was a combination of hope and careful restraint that she found it deeply moving if she was being honest, which she was. "I've been thinking about you too," she said. The restraint loosened somewhat, and what came through it was something luminous and a little astonished, as though he hadn't quite let himself believe she might say that. "Good," he said. "That's good." "It's all so complicated," she said, not because she wanted to diminish anything but because she was constitutionally incapable of pretending complications didn't exist. "I'm a woman with an unresolved property dispute in Missouri, a teaching position I've just taken, and no particular stability to speak of. I'm not in a position to—" She stopped. "I'm not asking you for any position," he said. "I'm not asking you for anything that needs stability to precede it. I'm just telling you that I think about you, and I want you to know that, and I'd like to spend more time with you if you're willing." He paused. "I told you that on the main street 3 weeks ago, and you said you were willing." She looked at him for a long moment. The calves moved in the late afternoon light, and the cottonwoods along the creek flickered silver and green, and the mountains stood on the horizon like a promise the land was making. "I am still willing," she said. He smiled, then the full version of the smile, not the predecessor but the thing itself, and it changed his entire face, made it younger and warmer and much more beautiful than it had any right to be. She felt the full force of it and had to look back at the calves for a moment to collect herself. June came in warm and extraordinary, the mountain spring advancing into something richer. Henrietta found herself in the routine of a life she had not planned but was beginning to understand was genuinely hers, her school, her students, her room at Calloway's, the Saturday mornings when Owen came to town. She was writing to Clara in Denver, long letters full of the country she was seeing and the life she was building. She was receiving letters from Mr. Beaumont, who was methodical and careful, and had responded to her instructions by placing a formal legal hold on the estate pending her authorization, which had, predictably, resulted in an extremely cold letter from Franklin that she had read once and then placed in the bottom of her trunk. She was also, with a gradualness that felt like the cottonwood leaves unfurling along the creek, inevitable because natural, falling in love with Owen Walden. She knew it the evening he came to Calloway's porch, not on a Saturday but a Wednesday, and he was not in his canvas coat but in a clean shirt and a vest, and he had his hat in his hands when Ruth opened the door, and Ruth had called for Henrietta with an expression of deeply satisfied neutrality. He had brought her a book. He'd ordered it from the bookseller in Denver 4 weeks before, and it had arrived, he said, in that morning's post, and he thought she might like it. It was a collection of scientific essays on plant life in the American West, which he had remembered her mentioning in passing as a subject she found interesting. She stood on the porch holding the book and looking at him, and thought that no one in her life had ever listened carefully enough to bring her exactly the right thing. "Thank you," she said. This is very thoughtful." "You mentioned it," he said, as though that made it simple. "Most people mention things they'd like to hear and don't mention things they'd like to give," she said. He looked at her, clearly not quite sure what to do with that, and she felt a rush of warmth so complete it was almost physical. They sat on the porch for 2 hours that evening, and Ruth Calloway went inside and did not come back out, which was a very specific kind of discretion that Henrietta filed away with gratitude. She told him about her mother that evening, Henrietta Sullivan, who had died when Henrietta was 12, and who had been the kind of woman who lit up rooms and then left them too soon. She told him how her mother's death had changed the household dynamics, how Franklin had stepped into the space left by their father's grief as though it were a role he'd been waiting for, how she had spent the next 11 years navigating a house that had never quite felt like home after that. He told her about Tennessee, the valley where he'd grown up, which he described with the particular loving detail of someone who had left a thing before they wanted to and knows they will not go back. He told her about his parents, who were both dead, who had been decent and hard-working and limited by the kind of poverty that makes people smaller than they might otherwise be. He told her about his Uncle James, who had been the most alive person he'd ever known, and who had brought him west as a last great adventure, and then gotten sick and died at 52 of a fever that should not have killed a man that strong. When he died, Owen said, looking out at the dark street, I had two options. I could go back east, which meant going back to poverty I'd already left in a family situation that wasn't really a family anymore, or I could stay and make the ranch work. He was quiet for a moment. I stayed. Do you ever regret it? He considered the question with real care, which was something she had come to expect from him and still appreciated every time. No, he said. But I reckon there are moments when I understand what I traded for it. It's very quiet out there some nights. There's a specific kind of quiet that's peaceful, and there's a specific kind that's lonely, and some nights I'm not always sure which one I'm in. She looked at his profile in the lamplight from the window. She thought about the 43 miles of open country between the ranch and the nearest city. She thought about 8 years of building something alone, of being entirely self-reliant by necessity rather than by choice. It shouldn't be so lonely, she said quietly. He turned to look at her, and the thing in his face was so unguarded for a moment that she felt it like a hand pressed gently against her own chest. No, he said, it shouldn't. The crisis, when it arrived, came in the form of a letter from Franklin. It was the second week of June, and she was sitting at the breakfast table at Calloway's when Ruth brought in the post. The letter was thick, 2 pages, in Franklin's upright, controlled hand, and it informed her that he had engaged his own attorney, a Mr. Dalton of St. Louis, who had filed a counterclaim against the estate hold, and that he was prepared to take the matter to the Missouri courts if necessary, and that he hoped she would reconsider the grief and expense she was causing the family, and that furthermore, this was the part that made her hands grip the paper. He had been in contact with the Archer family in Millhaven, and they were quite disappointed that she had failed to present herself as promised. And he thought it might be worth Henrietta understanding that her behavior was being noted. He had been in contact with the Archers. The implication was clear. He knew where she was, he had allies here, and he wanted her to know it. She put the letter down on the table very carefully and sat with it for a long moment. Then she picked it up, put it in her bag, and went to school. She taught her full day with complete competence, and only the occasional awareness, in the back of her mind, of a growing knot of something that was not quite fear, but was in the same neighborhood. She helped Mei Lin with a particularly complex multiplication problem that the girl had extrapolated from their current lesson. She read aloud to the younger children for half an hour. She dismissed everyone at 4 o'clock and then sat at her desk in the empty schoolroom and allowed herself, for exactly 15 minutes, to be afraid. Then she got up and went to the telegraph office and sent a wire to Mr. Beaumont in St. Louis. Received letter from brother regarding counterclaim, please advise status and prepare formal documentation protecting my interest your earliest convenience, H. Sullivan. Then she went to the livery and hired the buckboard. She arrived at the ranch as the light was beginning its long western descent toward the mountains. Owen was at the barn, and he came out when he heard the buckboard and looked at her face and said nothing at all, only held the horses while she climbed down. She told him about the letter standing outside the barn door, with the evening light coming at a low angle and the horses shifting gently behind him. She told him plainly, without dramatics, the way she had come to trust she could tell him things. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment, and then he asked 2 practical questions. Did she believe the Archers would make any direct trouble for her, and did she have documentation of the original will's terms? She said she didn't believe the Archers would move directly. She had never actually contracted with them, and they couldn't compel anything without cause. And yes, she had copies of the will terms. Her father's attorney had given her copies of all relevant documents when the will was first read. Then your legal position is solid, Owen said. Your brothers are making noise. Noise is worrying, but it's not the same as damage. He paused. Do you want me to ride into town with you? Stay close for a few days in case any of this comes here in person. Do you think it will? He thought about it honestly. Franklin sounds like the type who prefers to pressure from a distance. A man like that, a letter and a hired attorney is usually where it stops, because actually coming out here involves the inconvenience of actually coming out here. He looked at her. But if he sends someone or if the Archers get it into their heads to cause trouble, I'd like to be nearby. I don't want to be a burden to your work, she said. He looked at her with something that was half exasperation and half something much more tender. Henrietta, he said. It was the first time he had used her given name, and the effect of it was considerable. You are not a burden. She let out a long breath. Owen, she said, and the sound of his name in her own mouth felt like a key turning. I think I might need some help. Good, he said quietly, because I'd like to give it. He rode into town with her that evening, and he spoke to Ruth Calloway privately for a few minutes while Henrietta was upstairs, and whatever he said resulted in Ruth locking the front door somewhat earlier than usual, and making a point of mentioning over dinner that her neighbor on the east side was a retired deputy sheriff named Maddox who was, she said cheerfully, an excellent neighbor. Franklin did not, in the end, come west himself. But a man came, 3 weeks later, a formal-looking individual named Caraway who presented himself at the school one afternoon as a representative of Mr. Dalton's office, and who presented Henrietta with a document requiring her to appear in St. Louis Court to respond to the counterclaim. She read the document thoroughly. She was in the schoolroom, and Caraway was standing in front of her desk with the settled composure of a man accustomed to making people feel helpless. Mr. Caraway, she said, when she had read the last line, are you aware that I have my own attorney handling this matter, and that this document is required by law to be served through proper Colorado territorial channels before it compels any appearance? Caraway blinked. The document is properly served. I'd like to verify that, she said pleasantly. I'll be presenting it to Judge Parsons this evening. If it's in order, I will of course respond through the appropriate legal channels. She set it on her desk. Is there anything else? He left. She sat in the empty classroom for a moment and then, almost to herself, laughed, a short, surprised sound. She had not known she was going to say any of that, but she had read enough of her father's legal correspondence over the years, growing up in his house, that she had absorbed more of the language than she'd realized. She did take the document to Judge Parsons that evening, who looked it over and confirmed that as an out-of-territory legal document, it had limited immediate compulsory force, and that she had every right to respond through her own representation. He also said, with the dry precision of a judge who has seen a great deal, that it looked to him like someone was attempting to use legal process as a pressure tactic more than as an actual legal remedy. Owen was at the courthouse when she came out. He had been in town that day and had heard. Millhaven was small enough that Caraway's arrival at the school had been noted, and he was waiting on the courthouse steps with his hat in his hands. She told him what the judge had said. He listened, and when she was done, the steadiness she had come to think of as the most reliable thing she knew was there in his face, solid and warm. He's not going to win this, Owen said. No, she agreed. He's not. She stood on the courthouse steps in the fading evening light looking at the mountains and felt something enormous and quiet settling in her, not triumph, not yet, but the first real certainty that she was going to be all right. That she was going to win this in the way that really mattered, which was to remain free. He sent me west to disappear, she said. He thought the distance and the unfamiliarity would soften me. Did it? Owen asked, and there was something in his voice, a careful kind of hopefulness that had nothing to do with Franklin or the estate. She looked at him. The courthouse steps, the evening light, the mountains, and this man who had been waiting for her. She thought about the train platform in Kansas City, the ticket in her hand, the single conversation that had altered the entire direction of her life. She thought about 8 months from now, and a year and further. She let herself think about it fully, for the first time without putting walls around it. Not the way he intended, she said. He stepped down one step so he was level with her, and they were standing very close in the evening light. He put his hat back on and then, slowly and without hurry, reached out and took her hand. It was such a simple gesture, and it came after so much that had been complicated that she felt her eyes fill briefly before she controlled it. "I love you," he said, plainly, without ceremony, the way he said everything. "I thought you should know." She looked at him for a moment, at the steadiness of him, the honesty. The man who had looked at her on a train platform and seen that she needed to know there was more than one door, and had told her, and had waited, and had been there. "I love you too," she said. "I've been trying not to say it until I was certain." "Are you certain?" "Yes." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to it once with a tenderness that was entirely quiet, and she thought that this was how she wanted to be loved, not loudly, not with display, but with a certainty that was as solid as the mountains on the horizon and as warm as the Colorado summer light. The legal matter resolved itself in September, in the manner that Henrietta had, in her most optimistic moments, hoped it might. Mr. Beaumont innocent. Louis, who turned out to be both very good at his work and personally offended by the behavior of the Sullivan brothers, filed a series of legal responses that made the counterclaim significantly more complicated and expensive than Franklin had apparently anticipated. The Missouri court found in favor of the original will terms. Henrietta's third of the estate was hers, legally protected, beyond Franklin's reach. She received the letter from Mr. Beaumont on a Friday morning and sat down at the kitchen table at Calloway's and read it 3 times. Ruth, who was washing up the breakfast things, watched her read it and didn't say a word. "It's over," Henrietta said, looking up. Ruth dried her hands. "Tell me," she said. Henrietta told her. When she was done, Ruth sat down across the table and folded her hands and looked at her with those sharp blue eyes that, Henrietta had come to understand, contained a great deal more softness than they showed at first. "Good," Ruth said firmly. "Good, now what?" "Now I'll need to decide what to do with the income from the estate," Henrietta said. "It won't be enormous, but it's steady. The farmland, when properly tenanted, produces a reasonable return." She paused. "I'm going to keep teaching. Whatever else happens, I'm going to keep teaching." Ruth nodded as though that settled something. "Owen's coming tomorrow," she said. "I know. You should probably tell him about this." "I intend to." Ruth looked at her for another moment and then said, in a tone of voice that was the closest she ever came to direct emotional expression, "You've done very well, Henrietta. Your father would be proud of you." It was so unexpected and so accurate and so exactly what she had been quietly longing to hear from someone that it undid her for a moment, and she had to press her fingers against her eyes and breathe. Ruth poured her coffee and said nothing else, which was its own form of grace. She told Owen on Saturday morning, standing outside Hatch's general store in the same place she'd stood that first Saturday when she'd seen his canvas coat at the hitching post and walked toward him without quite intending to. He was quiet when she told him, listening with that complete attention, and when she was done he stood for a moment and looked at her. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Relieved," she said, "and free. I feel free, I think. I haven't been entirely sure what that would feel like, so I'm still identifying it." He smiled, and it was the full smile, the one that changed his face. "What are you going to do with it, the freedom?" "I have some ideas," she said. "I'd like to hear what you think of them." They walked along the main street in the late morning sunshine, and she told him her plans: to retain Mr. Beaumont as permanent representation for the estate, to have the farmland properly tenanted through legal agreements that protected her income, to build her savings through her teaching. And then, this was the part where she was not looking at him directly, eventually to consider whether she wished to remain at Calloway's, or whether she might be in a position to create different domestic arrangements. She ran out of words there, not because she lacked them, but because the one she needed felt very large and she wasn't sure of the precise form they should take. Owen stopped walking. She stopped alongside him. They were at the edge of town where the main street ran out into the open land, and the mountains were enormous ahead of them, and the autumn light, September light, amber and exact, lay across everything with the quality of something being preserved. "Henrietta Sullivan," he said. His voice was very steady, and there was something in it that she recognized as the same kind of controlled emotion she sometimes felt in herself when she was trying very hard not to overwhelm a moment with the size of what she felt. "Are you telling me that you're considering becoming a woman who might want a ranch?" She looked at him, and everything she was feeling must have been in her face, because his expression softened into something she had never quite seen from him before: pure, uncomplicated happiness. "I am considering becoming a woman," she said carefully, "who might want the man who has that ranch." He took both her hands in his, right there on the edge of town, in front of anyone who happened to be looking, which was very unlike him, and told her everything. "Marry me," he said. Not a question, exactly more like something being named rather than asked, because they both knew the answer already. "Yes," she said. They were married in November of 1882 on a Saturday in the small church at the north end of Millhaven's Main Street. The ceremony was performed by Reverend Adkins, who was a compact, earnest man who believed in saying the necessary words without adding unnecessary ones. Ruth Calloway stood as witness. Pete Dolan and Caleb Rays came in from the ranch in their best shirts, looking scrubbed and slightly uncomfortable and enormously pleased. Judge Parsons and his wife attended. May Lynn's father, Mr. Chen, who had become unlikely friends with Owen over a shared interest in irrigation problems, sat in the third pew and watched the proceedings with dignified pleasure. Clara Briggs came down from Denver. She had been corresponding with Henrietta for months now and had become, in the way of women who meet late but match exactly, a genuine and important friend. She arrived 2 days before the wedding and spent most of those 2 days telling Henrietta, with the emphatic warmth of someone who has been waiting a long time to say so, that she was radiant, that Owen Walden was clearly exactly what she needed, and that she, Clara, fully intended to come visit at least 4 times a year. Henrietta stood at the back of the church in the dress she had made with Ruth Calloway's help over the preceding 6 weeks, not white, which was impractical and somewhat performative, but the deep blue of a good October sky, silk and wool combined, with her mother's small pearl buttons at the cuffs and the collar. Ruth had declared it the finest piece of work to come out of their shared effort and had been right. Clara had braided her hair and placed it high on her head. She walked herself down the aisle because there was no father and no brother worth the designation. She walked steadily, at the pace she chose, looking at Owen at the far end, who was standing very straight in his good brown coat and holding his hat in his hands with a grip that gave away how hard he was working to contain what he was feeling. When she reached him, he looked at her for a moment without speaking, and then he said very quietly for her alone, "You are remarkable." "So are you," she said, and took his hand. They said their vows with equal weight. She had looked at the standard forms and made Reverend Adkins agree to certain modifications that removed the word obey and replaced it with cherish, which Reverend Adkins had agreed to after only minimal persuasion, because he was, as she had suspected, a man of genuine faith rather than institutional rigidity. They rode out to the ranch together after the small celebration at Calloway's, under a sky that had gone the deep purplish blue of a cold November dusk, with the first star out over the mountains. She was wearing her traveling coat over the wedding dress and sitting beside him on the buckboard, and their hands were together under the lap blanket, and she was aware of everything: the cold, the sound of the horses, the smell of pine coming down from the mountains, the warmth of him beside her, with the heightened clarity of a person who is in the midst of the best moment of their life and knows it. "This is the first time you'll sleep here," he said. "I know. How does that feel?" She considered it honestly. The way she had come to believe was the only worthwhile way to consider anything. Like something becoming true that has been true for some time, in a different form. She squeezed his hand. "Good. It feels good." The ranch house was warm when they arrived. Pete Dolan had been out earlier in the day to build up the fire and leave a supper prepared, which was a kindness so thoughtful and practical that she felt her heart full of it. The main room had the amber glow of the fire and the small lamp Owen had left burning, and the kitchen smelled of the venison stew Pete had left in the pot, and the whole house felt settled, inhabited, waiting. She stood in the center of the main room and looked around it. At the bookshelves he'd built, at the rag rug on the floor, at the curtains she had noticed on her first visit and thought were not quite right, and which she was already, somewhere in the back of her mind, beginning to replace, and felt the particular joy of a person who is home. He came up behind her and put his arms around her, and she leaned back into him, and for a long moment they stood there in the firelight without speaking, which was in its own way a continuation of every conversation they had ever had. "I've been lonely for a long time," he said quietly, against her hair. "I didn't entirely realize how lonely until you weren't." She turned in his arms and looked at him. "Neither did I," she said. "I thought it was just how things were, how people were." She reached up and touched his face, and his eyes closed briefly, and she felt the enormous quiet truth of it, that they had both been people who had learned to contain their loneliness by filling it with work and competence, and that they had found each other in the most sideways and improbable of ways, on a train platform in Kansas City, over a ticket she almost didn't question. She rose on her toes and kissed him for the first time in the proper context of what they were to each other, and it was everything. The first winter at the ranch was the kind of winter that tests a person's relationship with themselves, because the weeks of snowfall and isolation reveal what you are made of in a very specific and inarguable way. Henrietta found that what she was made of included more patience than she'd expected, a genuine enjoyment of her own company that had always been present, but that ranch life gave full expression to, and an ability to learn things quickly that she had not had many practical opportunities to demonstrate before. She continued teaching through the winter, driving the two-horse buggy Owen hitched for her into town on school days when the road was clear, staying at Calloway's, which Ruth had made clear was always available to her on the nights when the weather made the return trip unwise. Owen never said a word about those nights, only made sure the house was warm when she came back, and left a lamp burning in the window on the nights he expected her, the light visible from the road as she came up the last quarter-mile. She was not a woman who cried easily, but she cried, once, sitting in the kitchen at 4 in the afternoon on a January day when the snow was deep, and the light was going early, and the sight of that lamp in the window hit her with the full force of what it meant. That someone was thinking of her, specifically, and had arranged the particular detail of the light so that she would know it. She taught herself, that winter, several things that she had not known before: how to properly bank a fire, how to read the weather signs on the mountain horizon, how to put up preserves, and a considerable amount about cattle that Owen taught her in the evenings, going over the account books and the grazing plans with the same patience he brought to everything. She also began, in February, to write. Not letters, though she wrote many of those, but something longer, a kind of account of her first year west, starting with the train platform in Kansas City, and what it had felt like to stand there with the ticket in her hand. She didn't know what it was, exactly, not a novel, not a memoir in the formal sense, but something true that seemed to want to be written. She wrote it in the late evenings after Owen was asleep, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp turned up and the fire low, and she found in it a kind of clarity that surprised her. She showed it to Owen in March, just the first several pages, and he read it slowly and set it down and said, "That's the truest thing I've read in years." Which was everything she had hoped someone might say about it. Spring came back the way it always does, gradually and then completely, and the cottonwoods along the creek turned green again, and the calving season came, and Henrietta spent 2 extraordinary nights helping Owen with difficult births, learning, and coming away with the kind of deep physical knowledge of the world that no amount of schooling provides. She told him on a morning in April, standing in the kitchen while he was still at breakfast, that she believed she was expecting. He set down his coffee cup. She watched his face. She had been watching his face for nearly 18 months now and had learned its vocabulary, and what she read in it now was something so genuine and complex: joy, fear, love, the particular gravity of a person understanding that everything is about to change and accepting that willingly, that she crossed the kitchen and sat beside him and took his hand. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Yes," he said. Yes." He looked at her hand in his. "Are you all right?" "I think so," she said. I think I'm happy. I didn't expect to feel happy first before the fear, but that's what's there." He brought her hand up and held it against his face, and she felt him exhale a long, slow release of something. "We'll be good at this," he said. "Not a certainty, but an intention. The kind of intention that is better than certainty because it comes with the choice attached." "We'll learn," she said. "That's what we do." Their son was born in November of 1883, exactly 1 year after their wedding. They named him William James for Owen's uncle, William for her father, and he arrived, after a long and serious labor that Ruth Calloway managed with the steady competence of a woman who had seen this before. And the doctor came for the final part, red-faced and vigorous and vocal about his opinions on the world. Owen, who had been in the main room during most of this, came in when Ruth called him and stood at the bedside and looked at the child and then at Henrietta with an expression that was so completely stripped of any reserve that she thought she had never seen him more clearly than in that moment. "Hello, James," he said, very quietly to the baby. James considered this information and continued being vocal. "He's got opinions," Ruth said with profound satisfaction. "He does," Henrietta agreed. She was exhausted in a way that went all the way through her, but she was also more present in her body than she had been in years, raw and real and alive. She looked at Owen. "Sit here," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she moved so he could hold the baby, and watched his hands. Those careful, capable hands come around James with an instinctive gentleness that made her heart do something large and quiet. Clara came down from Denver for the first Christmas at the ranch, and it was the first Christmas that Henrietta had spent in a genuinely joyful house in a very long time. There was a tree. Owen had cut a small pine from the upper pasture, and she and Clara and Pete Dolan's wife Maria, who had become a friend of Henrietta's through the winter neighborliness of ranch country, spent an afternoon decorating it with paper ornaments and the few glass ornaments she had brought from St. Louis in her trunk. James, 6 weeks old, slept through most of this with magnificent indifference. On Christmas morning, Owen gave her a pair of pearl eardrops that he'd ordered from a jeweler in Denver, which was an extravagance that she recognized as such and received with a fullness of feeling that made him smile. She gave him a new saddle. She had arranged it through Pete, who knew exactly what Owen needed and had been specific in his advice to the saddle maker in the next town, and he ran his hands over the leather with the quiet pleasure of a man receiving exactly the right thing. They sat after dinner with Clara and James in the fire burning low, and Owen's arm was around her, and the sound of the wind was outside and the warmth was inside, and she thought about the train platform in Kansas City, about the ticket in her hand, about the moment this man had turned, and said to the trajectory her brothers had designed for her, in his plain and quiet way, "Not today." She told Clara about it that evening after Owen had gone to check the livestock, and it was just the two of them with the baby sleeping between them on the settle. "He didn't say that literally," Clara said when she'd heard the story. "No," Henrietta agreed. "He said most people have more choices than they think, which is the same thing." Clara looked at her with the fond exasperation of a woman who knows her friend is right. "You have become, I want you to know, extremely happy, and it is genuinely wonderful to see." Henrietta looked at the baby and the fire and the room and everything in it. "I have," she said. "I know." The years settled into themselves with the particular beauty of a life that is genuinely chosen. Millhaven grew. A bank arrived in 1884, and another church, and a proper doctor's office, and a millinery. The school expanded, and Henrietta eventually presided over 2 additional teachers and a newly built schoolhouse that Judge Parsons campaigned for and the town funded. Maylin graduated at 16 with the best mathematical record the school had produced, and Henrietta wrote her a letter of introduction to a school in Denver that had recently begun admitting women students in earnest. And Maylin went, and wrote back 3 months later with news of her studies and the particular fierce joy of someone who has been given exactly the room they needed to grow. Owen's ranch prospered quietly, year by year, the way good work does when it is sustained and the land is respected. He took on a third hand in 1885, a young man from New Mexico named Tomas who was 20 years old and serious-minded, and learned the work with a speed that Owen said reminded him of himself at 17. He said this at dinner one evening, and Henrietta watched the quality of it in his face, the continuity, the passing forward of something. The estate in Missouri was properly managed by Mr. Beaumont, who proved over the years to be one of the most reliable people she had ever hired. The income from the farmland added to their stability without being the center of it, which was exactly as she had intended. She corresponded regularly with Beaumont and made her own decisions about every transaction, and this fact, that she made her own decisions about things that were hers, in consultation with the husband she trusted rather than the brothers who had claimed authority, was a quiet, daily form of freedom that she never entirely stopped appreciating. She heard about Franklin rarely through Beaumont's letters, occasionally through mutual acquaintances. He had married a woman from a prominent St. Louis family in 1884 and appeared, from the outside, to be everything he intended to be. He did not attempt further legal action. Whether this was because Beaumont had made the costs clear, or because he had gotten enough of what he wanted from the estate without her portion, or because some fragment of something that might eventually become conscience had asserted itself, she did not know and had eventually stopped needing to know. She did not forgive him exactly. She was too honest with herself for that kind of tidy resolution, but she had put him down, the way you put down a very heavy thing, and found that her shoulders felt better without it. George wrote her once in 1885. A short letter, awkward and underexplained, that said essentially that he hoped she was well and that he had not agreed with everything that had happened. She wrote back a note of 3 sentences that said she was well, that she appreciated him writing, and that she hoped he was well also. It was the most she could give him, and it was enough. The second child was born in 1886 in May, when the cottonwoods were at their fullest green. They named her Alina for Henrietta's mother, and she arrived easier than James had and looked immediately like Owen, the same steady brown eyes, the same quality of deliberate attention in her tiny face, which made Henrietta laugh in the middle of an otherwise exhausting morning. "She is looking at everything exactly the way you do," she told Owen, when he came in and took the baby. He looked at Alina, who was indeed examining her father with the complete seriousness of someone conducting an assessment. "Is that worrying?" he asked. "No," Henrietta said. "I find it extremely reassuring." James was 3 by then, and he received his sister with the complex reception of a 3-year-old confronted with something that is simultaneously interesting and an imposition on his universe. He touched her hand once, very carefully, with his index finger, and then went back to his toys, which was, Henrietta thought, a fairly reasonable first response. By 1887, she had finished the long piece of writing she had been working on in private for years, the account that had started as the story of a train platform and expanded into something larger, a narrative of a woman building a life from a new start, of land and love, and the particular freedom available to a person who is willing to walk through the door someone else points out to them. She did not know what to do with it, and she left it in the trunk for nearly a year before she mentioned it to Clara, who mentioned it to a friend in Denver who knew a man who published a small literary journal, and the first 3 sections appeared in print in the autumn of 1888, under the title A Woman Going West, attributed to H.W. Walden. The response was modest and real, and included one letter from a woman in Illinois who wrote to say that she had read the sections and cried, and felt that someone had described something she herself had been unable to articulate. Henrietta read that letter at the kitchen table while Owen was at the barn and James was at school and Alina was napping, and she sat with it for a long time. She was 30 that autumn, and the life she inhabited was one she had made not alone, not through luck, but through a combination of her own refusal to accept the road her brothers had tried to set her on, and the kindness of a stranger on a platform who had said, in his plain and honest way, that most people have more choices than they think. She said as much to Owen that evening when she gave him the letter. He read it and handed it back and was quiet in the way that meant he was feeling something considerable. "Are you glad," he asked, "that you came west?" She looked at him across the kitchen table, at the man who had become the center of her world not by occupying it loudly but by being in it steadily, by asking good questions and listening to the answers, by holding her hand on courthouse steps and keeping a lamp burning in the window. "I was sent west to disappear," she said, "and instead I appeared." She reached across the table. "Because of you and because of me, both things are true." He took her hand. "Both things are true," he agreed. James came in from the porch then, stomping mud from his boots, 5 years old and energetic, and carrying some found object that he wished to show his father immediately. Alina could be heard waking from her nap, making the particular ascending sounds of a child approaching full consciousness. The lamp on the table cast its circle of amber light. Outside, the Colorado autumn was going gold and bronze on the cottonwoods along the creek, and the mountains on the horizon caught the last of the evening light in a way that turned them pink and violet and impossibly beautiful. This was the life. This specific, improbable, chosen, hard-won life. The sound of a child's boots, the lamp on the table, the hand across the table, the mountains going pink at dusk. In the spring of 1890, with both children in school and the ranch running well, Henrietta took on the role of school board member alongside Judge Parsons, who was aging but no less sharp, and used her position to push for expanded enrollment that included the children of the Chinese families and the 2 Ute families in the area who had been excluded in practice, if not in explicit policy. It was a slow fight, attended by the small, grinding resistance of people who do not like change and express this through procedure and delay, and she conducted it with the patience of a woman who has learned that the most important things are always slow. Owen came to school board meetings when she needed him there, sitting in the back row in his canvas coat, not speaking unless spoken to, but present, a fact that mattered, she had come to understand, in the particular way that facts sometimes matter not for their immediate content but for what they signal. His presence said, "She is not alone, and this matters enough to be present for." She won the enrollment issue in the late summer of 1890, incrementally and without fanfare, which was exactly the way such victories tend to arrive. She wrote about it to Clara and to Mr. Beaumont, and in a letter she felt uncertain about writing but wrote anyway, to the woman in Illinois who had written about a woman going west, whose name was Margaret Holloway and who had, over the 2 years since, become a correspondent. The children grew, as children do, with a particular speed that is terrifying and beautiful in equal measure. James at 7 was angular and serious and mad for horses in the specific way that children raised on ranches often are, completely comfortable with the animals, completely fluent in their language, spending every available hour in the barn or the corral. He had Owen's steadiness and Henrietta's precision, which was a combination that produced in him a very particular quality of quiet competence that she recognized from both sources, and was proud of in a way she tried not to make overwhelming. Alina at 4 was a different creature, entirely loud where James was quiet, improvisational where he was methodical, possessed of strong opinions that she articulated at considerable length. She had Owen's eyes and Henrietta's chin, and a gift for drawing that had appeared without apparent instruction, covering every available surface with images of horses and mountains and the faces of the people around her. A third child arrived in the autumn of 1892, another boy, whom they named Thomas, for no one in particular but because it suited him, and he arrived into a household that was full and warm and already practiced at love, and he fit into it with the easy confidence of someone who expects to be welcome and turns out to be right. Owen, watching 3-year-old Alina and newborn Thomas one evening while Henrietta rested, said to no one in particular, "I think about the ranch when I was here alone sometimes, 8 years of it, and I cannot account for it now, the shape of it. It was a different place." "It was," Henrietta said from the doorway where she had been listening. "It was waiting." He looked up at her. "For what?" "To be what it is now," she said. "It couldn't be this before." He considered that with the seriousness he brought to things that mattered. "You know," he said, "that night in Kansas City on the platform when I stopped to talk to you, I very nearly didn't. I thought it would be impertinent." "It would have been," she agreed, "in the sense of being presumptuous and unasked for." "Yes, but it was also necessary," she said. "Both things are true." He smiled, the full smile, the one that had been changing his face for 10 years now and still made her feel the warmth of it like sunlight. "Both things are true," he said, for the second time in their life together, and she thought it was a good thing to say twice. The years continued to lay themselves down with the quiet authority of time in a place where the seasons are large and honest, big winters and brilliant summers, and the extraordinary in-between seasons that the West does better than anywhere. She had come to believe in the country. She taught for 12 more years in Millhaven School, through 3 expansions and 4 additional teachers, until the school was a genuinely fine institution that the town was rightly proud of. She eventually stepped back from teaching itself to focus on administration and the continued improvement of the enrollment policies, and she was succeeded in the classroom by a young woman from Ohio named Agnes Porter, who was gifted with children and became, over the years, a friend. Owen's Ranch, in 1895, entered into a cooperative arrangement with 2 neighboring spreads to share grazing rights in a way that benefited all 3 operations, a project that he and Henrietta had planned together over several evenings at the kitchen table, going over maps and figures with the comfortable industriousness of 2 people who have learned each other's ways of thinking. James, at 12, was already a skilled horseman and was expressing interest in the cattle work with the specific intensity of a boy who has found his path early. Alina's drawings had grown into something that her parents could only describe as art. She had an eye that saw the landscape differently from anyone Henrietta had encountered, finding angles and qualities of light that made the mountains look like emotions rather than geography. Thomas was 8 and rambunctious, and devoted to his older brother and to the horses, and to a stray dog named Grant that had arrived at the ranch one winter and declined to leave. Ruth Calloway came to dinner at the ranch 3 or 4 times a year, brought out by the ranch buckboard and received with the affection due a woman who had been indispensable at the beginning of everything. She was in her 70s now and had turned the boarding house over to a niece, but she was still sharp-eyed and direct, and had an opinion on every subject that she offered without hesitation. The children adored her. James called her Miss Ruth. Alina drew her portrait from memory. Thomas, at 6, had once fallen asleep in her lap, and she had sat completely still for 2 hours rather than disturb him, which Henrietta had witnessed and stored in the part of her heart where the best things live. Clara came down from Denver twice a year, sometimes 3 times, and had eventually married a man named Henry Briggs, no relation to her family name, who was a civil engineer, and who got along remarkably well with Owen, the 2 of them finding common ground in the particular language of men who build and maintain things. Clara and Henrietta walked along the creek on Clara's visits and talked for hours, the conversation ranging from everything that mattered to them: the children, the town, the country, the books they were reading, the world as it was and as it might become. It was 1897, and Henrietta was 38, and Owen was 42, and the ranch was 15 years into what it had become, and the mountains were the same mountains, and the creek was the same creek, and the cottonwoods along it were older than they had been and more beautiful for it. James was 15 and already unmistakably himself. Eleanor was 11 and drawing with a seriousness that suggested she would not stop. Thomas was 7 and deeply happy in the way of children who live in good places. One October evening, with the aspens turned gold on the mountain slopes and the air carrying the particular cold and smoke smell of Colorado autumn, Owen came in from the lower pasture at dusk and stood in the kitchen doorway watching her make the evening meal, and she looked up and caught his expression. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Just looking." She gave him the look she gave him when he said something she found insufficient. He laughed a real laugh, warm and full, and came into the kitchen and put his arms around her from behind, and she leaned into him, still holding the wooden spoon, and they stood there in the kitchen that smelled of stew and autumn and lamp oil and the particular living warmth of a house that is full of people who love each other. "I was just thinking," he said against her hair, "about a train platform in Kansas City in 1882. She set down the wooden spoon, turned in his arms, looked at him, the face that was older now, weathered deeper, more itself than ever. "Were you?" she said. "Yes." His eyes were the color of creek water in summer, exactly as they had been on that platform, exactly as they were every morning when she saw them across the breakfast table. "I think about it sometimes, the specificity of it, that it was that morning, that particular train, that particular moment. If I'd been on a different car," she said, "if I'd gone to the ticket window earlier or later, if I hadn't been standing there looking at my ticket as though it had personally offended me." He smiled. "I saw your face," he said, "and I thought that woman is making a decision and she doesn't have enough information to make it well." "That was very presumptuous," she said. "Yes." It was also exactly right. He held her gaze, and the firelight was coming through the kitchen doorway, and the October dark was outside the window, and somewhere in the house Eleanor was singing something to herself, a habit she'd had since she was small. "Henrietta," he said. Her name in his mouth had never lost its particular quality, the sound of something meant. "Owen," she said. There were 15 years between that train platform and this kitchen, and those 15 years contained everything: the fight for her inheritance, the boarding house, the school, the calving seasons, the writing, the letters, the children, the winters, the mountains, the slow and extraordinary process of two people learning each other so thoroughly that they had become, without losing themselves, a single thing. She reached up and touched his face, the way she had on the porch of the courthouse the evening he'd told her he loved her. "I think we should have more stew," she said, "and then you should tell the children the story of the train platform, because James asked me about it last week, and I said you should be the one to tell it." He raised an eyebrow. "The story of how I was presumptuous. The story of how both of us were exactly who we needed to be at exactly the right time," she said, and turned back to the stove. They had supper with the children around the long table Owen had built, and after supper, while Thomas was claiming that he was not tired and Eleanor was sketching by the fire and James was doing his school reading, Owen told the story. He told it simply and without dramatizing it: the platform, the woman with the ticket, the conversation, the train. He told it the way he told everything, plainly, without unnecessary ornament. Halfway through, James looked up from his book and looked at his mother. "You almost just went to the Archers," he said. "I might have," she said. He looked at his father with the specific expression of a 15-year-old confronting the contingency of his own existence. That's, yes," Owen said. "That's why you talk to people," Eleanor said, without looking up from her sketch, with the casual certainty of a child who has been listening and drawing at the same time and has arrived at a conclusion. "Partly," Henrietta agreed, "because you don't know when someone is the right person." "You never know," Henrietta said, "so you listen, and you tell the truth, and sometimes, if you're fortunate, the right person is there." Alina looked up then, directly at her mother, with those steady brown eyes that were Owen's eyes in her face. "Is Papa the right person?" she asked, in the tone of a child asking a real question rather than a sentimental one. Henrietta looked across the table at Owen, who was looking back at her with everything in his face. "Yes," she said, "he is." The fire settled. Thomas had, in fact, fallen asleep in his chair, exactly the way he'd been claiming he wouldn't. James went back to his book. Alina went back to her sketch. The house was full of warmth and the sound of breathing and the distant voice of the wind in the cottonwoods along the creek. Outside, the Colorado night was enormous and clear and full of stars. The mountains invisible in the dark but present, always present. The same mountains that had stood on the horizon when she stepped off the train at Millhaven 15 years ago with her carpet bag and her trunk, and the decision she had made on a platform in Kansas City, because a stranger had told her there was more than one door. She had walked through it. She had built her life on the other side of it with her own hands and with his, and it was real, and it was hers, and it was good. Owen reached across the table and took her hand, and she laced her fingers through his, and that was everything, that simple, practiced, chosen gesture, after 15 years still the thing she wanted most when she needed to be certain of the world. The lamp burned on the table. The fire burned in the hearth. The children breathed and drew and slept and read. The mountains waited in the dark. And Henrietta Sullivan Walden, who had been sent west to disappear, and had, instead, become more fully herself than she had ever been, held her husband's hand in the warm kitchen of the life she had made, and was content in a way that went all the way down.